It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a rented cabin about 2 hours north of Spokane, Washington. I had just turned 31 and needed a break from work, city noise, and people in general. The cabin belonged to a retired forestry worker who rented it out to hunters and hikers during the off-season. It sat near the edge of a dense pine forest, about a mile off a dirt service road that connected to Highway 395. The man told me there wouldn't be anyone else around that weekend since the hunting season hadn't started yet. That actually sounded perfect to me at the time. I arrived there late Friday afternoon, just before sunset. The cabin was small but clean. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom with a rusty water heater, and a narrow living room that faced the woods. The smell of old pine and smoke from past fires filled the place. There was a stone fireplace against one wall with a pile of split logs beside it. Outside, behind the cabin, was a shed and an old generator that supplied some of the electricity when the main line flickered. The air was colder than I expected for September, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees carried constantly, a low, rushing hum that filled every quiet moment. After unpacking my duffel bag and a few groceries, I sat on the porch with a cup of instant coffee. The forest stretched out endlessly ahead. Tall pines, some over 50 feet high, formed a wall of green shadows. There were no neighboring cabins in sight. The silence was heavy, only broken by the occasional caw of a crow or the snapping of branches far in the distance. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, almost unnervingly so. By nightfall, I had lit the fireplace and was sitting by it, reading from a paperback novel. The glow of the flames flickered across the wooden walls, and I could hear the faint tapping of pine cones hitting the roof outside. Around 9, I heard something unusual. It was faint, like the crunch of leaves or gravel, coming from behind the cabin near the shed. I figured it might be a raccoon or a deer, since the area was full of them. The sound would stop and then start again, a few seconds at a time. I turned down the fire to listen better. Then it stopped completely. I brushed it off and went back to my book, but the uneasiness stayed. When I finally went to bed around midnight, I kept the flashlight beside me. The next morning, I woke up early and stepped outside. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The grass was wet with dew. I walked around to the back of the cabin just out of curiosity. There were muddy prints near the shed boot prints. They weren't mine. I checked my own and compared them, and the size was definitely larger. Whoever it was had walked around the shed and back toward the tree line. The dirt was soft from recent rain, so the tracks were clear. It looked like one person. I stood there for a while, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The thought of someone walking around out there at night while I was inside sleeping didn't sit right with me. I checked the shed to see if maybe someone had been trying to get inside. The latch was slightly bent, like it had been pulled or forced. Inside, nothing looked stolen, just old tools and fuel cans. Still, it was enough to make me alert. I told myself it could have been the owner checking on something, but he lived miles away and had no reason to come that late. I locked the shed properly and made sure the cabin door's deadbolt worked. It did, though it was a bit loose in the frame. The rest of the day, I tried to relax. I went for a short hike through the woods, followed a trail that led down to a small stream, and took a few photos. I didn't see anyone. No signs of hunters, hikers, or campers. When I got back that afternoon, I noticed the wind had picked up and the sky was turning gray, heavy with clouds. By evening, a light drizzle started. I cooked a can of soup and ate by the window, staring out into the dim forest. The rain tapping on the roof made a rhythmic sound that was both calming and eerie. Around 10 that night, I was sitting by the fire again when I heard something on the porch. This time it was distinct, a slow creak, like someone stepping on the wood boards outside. My heart jumped. I turned off the small lamp and just listened. The sound came again, one step, then another, Whoever it was stopped near the door. I stayed completely still. The doorknob rattled once, softly. I could hear my pulse in my ears. After a few seconds, the steps moved off the porch and faded toward the trees. I didn't move for nearly a minute after that. I finally grabbed the flashlight and looked out the front window. It was too dark to see anything beyond the edge of the light from the porch lamp. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I kept the fire going until morning, more for comfort than warmth. When daylight came, I checked outside again. Fresh boot prints, same size as before, on the porch and in the dirt near the steps. They led around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the forest. I took photos of them on my phone just in case. My first thought was that maybe someone local was messing with me, maybe a hunter or some drifter. But there was no vehicle on the road when I checked. The forest was quiet again, but that calm now felt wrong, like something was hiding just out of sight. By mid-afternoon, I made up my mind to leave early the next morning. I didn't want to pack up in the dark. I tried to distract myself that day, but the tension never left. Every sound outside made me glance at the windows. At one point, I thought I saw movement far off between the trees, something or someone walking parallel to the cabin, but I couldn't tell for sure. The rain had started again, turning the ground soft and muddy. The forest was darker than usual under the overcast sky. That night was the worst. I made sure the doors were locked and dragged one of the kitchen chairs under the doorknob as a wedge. I shut all the curtains and kept the fire low so there wasn't too much light inside. Around midnight, I was lying in bed half awake when I heard a loud thud from outside, like something heavy had fallen. Then silence. A few minutes later, faint but clear, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the wet ground. I stayed still, barely breathing. The steps stopped near the bedroom window. I could see the faint shape of a shadow through the curtain. It lingered there for several seconds, then moved away. I grabbed my flashlight, crept to the living room, and peered through a tiny gap in the curtain. The porch light was off, but I could make out a shape. Someone standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. They were facing the cabin, not moving. I couldn't tell if they were wearing a hood or a hat, but they were definitely watching. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the flashlight. I backed away from the window and quietly took the fireplace poker from beside the hearth. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting near the door, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things immediately. I loaded my stuff into the truck as quickly as I could. Before I left, I walked to the tree line where I had seen the figure standing. The ground there was muddy, and there were deep boot prints facing the cabin, just as I expected. They led off into the woods and disappeared among the pines. I didn't follow them. I just turned back, locked the cabin door, and started my truck. As I drove down the dirt road toward the highway, I caught myself looking in the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching from between the trees. When I finally hit the paved road, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me laugh. I didn't stop until I was back in town. Later that week, I called the owner to tell him what had happened. He sounded concerned and said there shouldn't have been anyone around that property. He mentioned there had been reports in past years of people trespassing or squatting in cabins up there, but no one had been caught. He thanked me for letting him know and said he'd check it out. I never heard back after that, and I didn't ask. I still think about that weekend sometimes. I think about the sound of those footsteps in the dark, the prints around the shed, and the figure standing in the rain just watching. Whoever it was, they weren't lost or wandering. They knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. That was the last time I ever rented a cabin alone. It was late October, 2017. when I took a seasonal job as a park ranger at a remote section of Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. I was 31 at the time, single, and needed a break from the noise of city life. The ranger station was small, just a wooden cabin tucked between tall pines and thick brush, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a desk with a two-way radio that barely worked on cloudy days. The drive in alone made me realize how isolated it was. The dirt road twisted through endless forest, and after sunset, it turned pitch black except for the narrow slice of light from my truck's beams. There were no other cabins, no campers that late in the season, no sound except the wind sliding through the trees. I was stationed there to monitor fire risks and check for poachers, but really, it felt more like being left alone with the wilderness itself. The first few days went fine. I spent my mornings walking the trails, checking boundary markers, and writing notes on any signs of wildlife activity. The silence out there was heavy. You start noticing every small noise, the snap of a branch, the flutter of wings, even your own footsteps crunching against the damp ground. The air was always cold, smelled like pine sap and dirt. Nights were colder, the kind of cold that seeps through the cabin walls no matter how hot the stove burned. On the sixth night, a storm rolled in. The wind picked up hard, and by evening, the trees outside were bending under it. The radio signal dropped completely. I couldn't reach the ranger station back in town. Rain hammered the roof nonstop, and the power flickered a few times before going out completely. I sat there with a lantern, trying to read an old field manual just to distract myself. Around midnight, I started hearing something outside, like branches snapping, but heavier, slower. Not the wind, something moving around the cabin. I put on my jacket and boots and grabbed the flashlight. When I stepped out onto the porch, the rain hit me hard, and the beam of light barely reached the treeline. The ground was soft and muddy, and I could see deep boot prints, fresh ones, leading away from the cabin toward the back trail. I froze for a second, trying to remember if I'd walked there earlier. I hadn't. The prints weren't mine. They were too big, too wide apart, and there were at least two sets. The thought that someone might be out there in that storm made my stomach tighten. I scanned the trees, but everything was just moving shadows and sheets of rain. I went back inside and locked the door. The wind made the whole cabin creak, and every time it did, it felt like footsteps on the porch. I sat at the desk for a long time just listening. I must have stayed awake till dawn because when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was cutting through the window. When I went out the next morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked. I followed the tracks again. They led behind the cabin, down a narrow path that wasn't part of any marked trail. It went deep into the woods, weaving between thick trees and fallen logs. After about 200 yards, I found a small clearing and what looked like an old campsite. There was a fire ring, some rusted cans, and a torn blue tarp tied between two trees. It looked abandoned, but not for long. The ashes in the fire ring were dark and clumped like they'd been wet recently, and there was a half-empty can of beans sitting beside it that hadn't rusted yet. Someone had been camping here within a day or two. I searched the area carefully but didn't find anything else. No bags, no tools, no vehicle tracks. Just that tarp and those footprints. It made me uneasy thinking someone was that close to the cabin without checking in. We usually got hunters around this time of year, but they always signed the logbook. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept checking the windows even though I knew there was nothing out there. Around 10 p.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time lighter but closer. They circled the cabin once, slow, deliberate, like whoever it was knew exactly where I was. I turned off the lantern and stayed completely still, listening to my own breathing. After a few minutes, I heard the sound move away toward the woods. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I checked the mud again. New prints, smaller ones like from a different pair of boots, but they stopped about 10 feet from the back door and then turned back toward the trees. I started to think maybe someone was watching the place deliberately. Maybe squatters, maybe poachers hiding something out here. Later that day, I hiked further down the same hidden path. About half a mile in, I found another clearing, this one with an old, half-collapsed wooden shack. It didn't look like any ranger structure. The door was hanging off one hinge, and inside, it smelled of wet wood and rot. There was a cot with a moldy blanket, an old lantern, and a small pile of animal bones stacked in a corner. I looked closer and saw that the bones were from deer, but some had been sawed clean, like someone had been stripping the meat with a tool. Next to them was a metal bucket with dried blood on the rim. I didn't stay long. The air in there was heavy and cold, even though it was midday. I took a few photos on my phone for the report and left. That night was the worst. The wind was dead calm, so every sound carried clearly. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the faint noise of something scraping against the cabin wall. It came from the side near the window by my bed. Slow, steady scraping like someone running a stick along the siding. Then silence. I got up quietly, picked up my flashlight, and walked to the window. When I aimed the light outside, I caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape ducking behind a tree. I couldn't see who or what it was, but I saw a flash of fabric, like a jacket or coat sleeve. I went outside right away, heart pounding, scanning with the flashlight. The ground around the cabin was covered in fresh mud, but the prints were all over the place now, circling the entire building, some overlapping others. There were at least 3 different sets. They disappeared into the woods again, all heading in different directions. At that point, I decided I'd had enough. As soon as it was light out, I packed my gear, locked up the cabin, and started driving back toward the ranger headquarters. The road out was rough, covered in puddles from the rain, and halfway down the trail I saw something that made me stop. A small clearing on the side of the road had a pile of burned wood and what looked like torn clothing, brown jacket pieces, scorched and blackened, and next to it a metal pot with more animal bones. I didn't look too closely. I just got back in the truck and drove. When I reached the main station, I filed a report, handed in the photos, and told them about the campsite, the shack, and the footprints. The senior ranger told me they'd send a team to check it out, but he didn't sound surprised. He said every few years they found squatters living deep in the forest, people avoiding the world, sometimes dangerous, sometimes just broken. They'd usually clear them out quietly. A few weeks later, I got a call. They'd gone out there to investigate. The shack was gone, completely burned to the ground. No sign of the tarp or any other items I'd mentioned. Just ash and some melted metal. No footprints, no sign of anyone. The team assumed whoever was living there had packed up and moved on after realizing someone had found their hideout. I didn't go back to that cabin after that. I finished the season at a different post closer to the main road, where I could at least hear other people's voices now and then. Sometimes, when I think about those nights in Bitterroot, I still picture that moment outside the cabin. The sound of slow footsteps in the mud, the scrape against the wall, the glimpse of a dark shape moving just beyond the edge of the light. I tell myself it was just trespassers, maybe hunters camping illegally. But the part that keeps bothering me is how quiet they were. Whoever it was, they didn't make a sound except when they wanted to. And in the woods, when something moves that silently, you never really know how long it's been watching you before you notice it. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to spend a few days alone at an old cabin deep in the woods near Dry Creek, Montana. I had taken a week off from work, thinking a quiet place with no phone signal and no people would help me clear my head. The cabin belonged to a distant uncle who had passed years ago. No one in the family cared much about the place. It was too far, too quiet, and too rough for a normal stay. But for me, that sounded perfect. The drive there took nearly 6 hours. Once I left the main road, the last 30 minutes were on a narrow dirt path lined with dry pine trees, dust rising behind my truck. I remember how the sound of my tires over gravel echoed strangely through the empty woods. I didn't pass a single car, not even a sign of another person. The only sound was the wind brushing through branches and the soft creaking of my truck's suspension over uneven ground. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. It sat on a slight hill with a small clearing around it, half surrounded by tall pines that cast long shadows over the roof. The wood was gray and weathered, the porch steps sagging under my weight as I went up. A rusty metal chair sat near the door, and an old axe leaned against the wall beside a pile of cut logs that looked like they'd been sitting there for years. The air smelled like sap, dry earth, and something faintly metallic. Maybe the old rusting nails and hinges. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, a small table, and a single dusty window facing the trees. The boards creaked under my boots. A shelf with a few cans of beans and old tools sat near the wall. There was a trapdoor under a rug in the corner that led to the crawl space, but I didn't bother with it at first. The place felt still, untouched, but not exactly welcoming. I brought in my cooler, a few bags, and my dog, Riley, a mixed breed, part shepherd, part who knows what. He seemed uneasy the moment we entered. He kept sniffing the air and pacing near the back wall. I told myself it was just the smell of old wood and rodents, though I kept catching that faint metallic scent again, stronger near the back of the room. After settling in, I took a walk around the property. Behind the cabin, the trees were dense, the kind that block sunlight even during the day. There was a faint trail leading down toward the creek. I followed it for a bit until I reached the water, a shallow stream that barely moved. The silence there was thick. I remember feeling watched, though I saw nothing but the trees and my own reflection in the water. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was already low. The shadows from the trees stretched far across the clearing. I built a small fire outside, ate a sandwich, and sat with Riley beside me, watching the sky darken. That's when I first noticed the noise. It was faint, like the sound of something brushing against wood. A scraping sound came from inside the cabin. At first, I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten inside. The old place wasn't exactly sealed tight. I went in, flashlight in hand. The sound stopped. The air inside felt heavier, like the temperature had dropped slightly. I checked around, even lifted the rug covering the trapdoor. The small latch was slightly bent, like someone had forced it open once. I didn't like that. I decided I'd nail it shut in the morning. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Riley kept growling softly at random intervals, staring toward the back wall. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of wood tapping. Slow, deliberate. Top, top, top. It wasn't from the roof. It came from underneath the floor. I froze. Riley stood, hackles raised, staring at the floorboards. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it. The tapping stopped, then silence again. I kept the flashlight in my hand and stayed awake until dawn. In the morning, I checked under the cabin. The crawl space was low, barely 3 feet of space between the ground and the floorboards. There was no sign of anything living down there, just old debris, cobwebs, and a couple of rusted cans. Still, the ground looked disturbed, like someone or something had moved around under there recently. The dirt had clear marks, small uneven impressions like footprints, though I couldn't tell what kind. I brushed it off, telling myself maybe an animal had dug through. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I nailed the trapdoor shut with the small hammer I found on the shelf. Riley watched the whole time, his eyes following my every move. The second night was worse. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Not a single cricket or owl. Around midnight, the tapping started again. This time, it was faster, like someone crawling, dragging something along the floor from beneath. I didn't move. I just sat there on the bed, flashlight off, holding my breath. Riley growled low but didn't bark. The sound moved from under the bed to under the stove, then stopped completely. I thought about grabbing my gun from the truck, but the thought of stepping outside into the dark kept me frozen where I was. When the sun came up, I decided I'd had enough. I started packing up. I went outside to load my truck, but when I came back in for the last of my stuff, the rug was pushed slightly to the side. The nails I'd driven into the trapdoor were bent outward, like something had forced them from underneath. My stomach dropped. I didn't even think. I grabbed my bags, called Riley, and slammed the cabin door shut behind me. The entire time I was walking to my truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting someone, or something, to be watching me from the window. But there was nothing, just the still trees and that empty cabin standing in the clearing, looking older than ever. When I drove away, I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I didn't look back, but I could still feel that place sitting behind me like a weight. That night, when I got home, I went over everything in my head. The sounds, the nails, the marks under the cabin. I tried to come up with explanations. Animals, loose boards, my imagination, but none of it made complete sense. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the local county office, asked about the property records and if anyone had lived there recently. The woman on the phone said the place had been empty for over 15 years. But she did mention something else. Apparently, in 2003, a man who rented the cabin for hunting had gone missing. They never found him. His truck was still parked out by the road, doors unlocked, gear still inside. That made my stomach turn. I went online that night and found an old newspaper clipping about it. The man's name was Greg Sanders. They said his hunting dog was found near the creek days later, exhausted but alive. No sign of Greg. I looked at the photo of him in the article. He was around my age, wearing a hunting jacket, standing beside a cabin, the same one I had stayed in. After reading that, I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about the sound from under the floor, the nails bent from the inside, the disturbed dirt. I tried telling myself it was an animal, maybe an old sinkhole or shifting wood, but deep down, I couldn't believe that. I never went back to Dry Creek. A few months later, I heard from a friend that a forest fire had passed through that area, burned most of the woods, including a few old cabins. I checked the reports online. One photo showed the remains of mine. The walls had collapsed, the roof gone. But in the middle of the ashes, there was the outline of the crawlspace entrance, the trapdoor completely gone. That should have given me closure, but instead it made it worse. I couldn't help imagining what might have been under there all those years. The thought of it being gone now didn't make me feel safer. It just meant whatever was under there wasn't buried anymore. Sometimes, late at night, when I take Riley out into the yard, he still freezes for no reason. He'll look toward the trees behind my house and start growling softly, the same way he did that first night in Dry Creek. I tell myself it's just a deer or a stray cat, but when I hear him whining at the floor in my living room, staring down like he hears something moving underneath, I have to leave the lights on, because even though I left that cabin behind, it doesn't feel like it left me. It was early October of 2016 when I decided to take a few days off from work and drive out to a small cabin I'd rented in the countryside. I lived in the city then, and everything about it had started to wear me down. The noise, the traffic, the people, the constant rush. I wanted silence. I wanted to wake up to the sound of wind instead of car horns. I found this cabin listed online, owned by some old couple who lived 2 towns over. It was cheap, simple, and surrounded by nothing but open fields and patches of forest. It seemed perfect. The drive took about 6 hours. Most of it was smooth highway, but the last stretch turned into narrow dirt roads that twisted through endless farmland. My phone had already lost service an hour earlier. It felt strange, comforting and unsettling at the same time, to be completely cut off. When I finally reached the cabin, the sky had started to dim. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, and the sound of crickets came from somewhere in the tall grass. The cabin itself was small but solid. Weathered wood, tin roof, one front porch with a single chair and a few steps leading up to it. Inside there was one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a fireplace. Everything was old but tidy. Faded curtains, a few dents in the metal sink, and a squeaky floor that gave under your feet. There was no television, no internet, and the only light came from a few weak bulbs that flickered slightly when turned on. I had brought my dog, Max, with me. He was a large, calm Labrador who'd been with me for 6 years. As soon as we got there, he started sniffing around, circling the porch, tail stiff but not wagging. I remember watching him walk toward the edge of the tree line about 50 yards out, nose pressed to the ground, and I had this faint uneasiness that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was just me adjusting to being alone after months of constant noise. That first night was calm. I made a small fire, cooked some canned food, and sat outside under the stars while Max lay next to me. The night air was cold but clean. I could hear the faint rustle of the trees and the creak of the cabin as it cooled in the darkness. Everything was peaceful until sometime around midnight, when Max suddenly stood up. His ears pricked, and he let out this low, drawn-out growl. It wasn't loud, but it was the kind of sound that made every hair on my arms stand up. I looked out into the field but couldn't see anything. The light from the cabin barely reached a few feet off the porch. Beyond that was pure darkness. I listened hard, holding my breath, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, not even the sound of insects for a few seconds. Then everything went quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Max stayed alert for another minute before lying back down, though his head stayed up. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he'd heard an animal, a raccoon, a coyote, something harmless. But I didn't sleep easily that night. The next morning, I went for a short walk with Max around the property. The air was cool, and the ground was damp from rain the night before. The path around the cabin led toward the tree line, where the forest began. I noticed prints in the mud, not just mine or Max's, but something else. They were faint, like boot marks, heading from the direction of the woods toward the cabin. At first, I thought maybe they were old, maybe from the owners or someone who stayed there before me. But when I followed them, they ended a few feet from the back wall of the cabin and then just stopped. No return prints, no clear sign of where they'd gone next. I didn't think much of it at the time. Could have been washed out by rain, I told myself. Still, it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. That day, I spent cutting some firewood, reading a bit, and trying to enjoy the quiet. The wind blew steadily all afternoon, and I could hear it moving through the fields like a low sigh. Around sunset, I noticed something strange again. The gate at the end of the dirt road that led to the cabin had been closed when I arrived, but now it was open. It wasn't a big gate, just a simple metal one, but it creaked loudly when moved. I hadn't heard it during the day. I walked over to it, half expecting to find some neighbor or someone passing through, but there was no one, just open space and fading light. I closed it again and made sure to latch it properly. I remember the sound of the metal lock clicking into place, sharp and solid. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw Max standing on the porch, watching me intently. He didn't move until I got close, then went inside without hesitation. I didn't realize until later how strange that was, how alert he'd been, how quiet. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the sound of the wind against the windows. Every so often, I thought I heard something else. something like a faint scrape, as if someone brushed against the outside wall. At one point, Max started growling again, low and steady, while staring at the front door. The hairs on his back were raised, and his body was tense. I got up slowly and stood behind him, trying to listen. There it was again, a light crunch, like a footstep in the dirt outside. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like a full minute. Then silence. No movement, no sound. I stood there for a long time, watching the door, until eventually I forced myself back into bed. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that the gate was open again. This time I knew it wasn't the wind. The latch couldn't just come loose on its own. I walked out, scanning the ground for any new footprints, but the soil had hardened overnight. Max stayed close to me, tail low, ears twitching at every small sound. By the third night, the fear had settled into me so deeply that I could barely eat. I kept the lights on inside and placed a heavy iron tool, a fire poker, next to the bed. Every noise outside made my heart jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard what I can only describe as the slow creak of the porch boards. One step, then another, then silence. I stayed completely still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I could hear Max breathing heavily beside the bed. His head was up, facing the door. Then, faintly, a soft sound came, a metallic rattle. The door handle. Someone was testing it. I could see the faint shadow of movement under the crack of the door, just a shifting darkness. I didn't move for several minutes, just listened until it stopped. Eventually, whoever or whatever was out there must have realized the door was locked because the sound faded and the porch went silent again. When morning came, I found clear footprints on the porch steps. They were fresh, deep from the weight of someone standing there wearing boots, the kind of boots you'd wear for working outside. The marks led up to the door and turned around again, heading toward the dirt road. I felt a cold wave of dread wash through me. Someone had been there. Someone had tried to get inside. I packed my things that morning. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I loaded up the car and called Max to get in. As I drove down the dirt road, I looked once in the rearview mirror. The gate was open again. I didn't stop to close it this time. Later, when I reached the main road and finally got signal on my phone, I called the couple who owned the cabin to tell them what had happened. The man sounded calm but uneasy. He said there had been reports before. Tools missing, doors found open, strange footprints, but they had assumed it was kids trespassing. He said they'd try to look into it. That was the last time I ever went back there. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every small creak in my apartment made me tense. I kept thinking about those boot prints and how close they had come to the door. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural that scared me. It was the thought of a real person, out there in the dark, watching, waiting for me to fall asleep. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a few days off work and head up north to my small hunting cabin in Montana. I had built that cabin with my own hands years ago, and it always felt like a place where I could breathe again, far from the noise and stress of everything else. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 3 miles from the nearest dirt road, tucked between thick pine trees and a slope that dropped down toward a narrow creek. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful during the day, but once the sun went down, everything changed. The woods became darker than you'd imagine, and every sound seemed closer than it really was. I had my dog, Rex, with me. He was a 4-year-old German Shepherd, strong and loyal, the kind of dog that never left your side. He'd been up to the cabin with me a few times before, and he always seemed to love it there. He'd chase squirrels, sniff around the trees, and lay by the fire once night came. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was crisp, and you could smell winter coming. The drive had been long, and my back ached from sitting for hours. When I parked the truck near the tree line, the cabin was half hidden behind the brush, looking exactly like it always did. A little rough around the edges, but sturdy. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell of old wood and ash from the fireplace hit me immediately. The first evening went as expected. I unloaded my gear, brought in the food and supplies, and lit a small fire. Rex sniffed around inside, circling the place like he was making sure everything was how we left it. When it got dark, I sat by the fire, eating a can of chili straight from the pot, listening to the faint sounds outside, branches shifting in the wind, the creek running, a distant owl. It was calm, but later that night, I noticed Rex getting restless. Around midnight, he lifted his head from the floor, ears pointing up. He gave a low growl, not loud, but enough to make me sit up. I turned down the lantern and listened. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up, but then I heard it. Faint footsteps outside, slow and uneven, crunching the dry leaves near the porch. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle, though I didn't step out yet. I wanted to be sure of what I heard. The footsteps moved again, this time circling the cabin. My heart started pounding. I stayed quiet, standing near the window, trying to catch a shadow or some sign of movement. Rex stood close to me, his fur standing up along his neck, a low growl rumbling from his chest. After a minute, the sound faded. Nothing else followed. I waited another half hour before setting the rifle down and blowing out the lantern. Rex stayed awake most of the night, every once in a while growling at something I couldn't hear. The next morning, I walked outside. The ground was damp, and the air was cold. I circled the cabin, checking for any sign of animals or someone passing through. That's when I saw the footprints, large, heavy, and human. They came from the woods behind the cabin and stopped right near the porch steps. They were deep in the soil, meaning whoever it was had been standing there for a while. I didn't like it. Nobody had any reason to be out there, not that far into the woods. The nearest neighbors were a good 6 miles away. I followed the prints for a few yards until they disappeared into the tree line, heading west. I didn't chase them. Instead, I went back inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. I spent the day cutting some wood and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Rex didn't leave my side. Normally, he'd run off to explore, but this time he stuck close, like he knew something wasn't right. Every now and then, he'd stop and stare into the trees, ears twitching, tail stiff. By evening, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't see or hear anyone, but it was the same instinct you get when you just know someone's eyes are on you. When night came, I built a bigger fire inside, trying to keep it bright. I set my rifle next to the chair, just in case. It was around 2 in the morning when it started again. The sound was softer this time, like someone was trying to move quietly. The leaves outside barely crunched, but Rex heard it before I did. He got up fast, stood by the door, and started growling deep and steady. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the flashlight again. I walked to the window and peeked through the small crack in the curtain. The light from the fire inside barely reached the edge of the porch, but I caught something. A faint movement near the tree line. It looked like a figure standing still. It wasn't close enough to see details, just a dark shape blending with the trees. I stood there frozen, not sure what to do. After a few seconds, the figure moved again, just a step, and then it was gone. I waited, staring, but I didn't see it come back out. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Rex stayed alert, pacing between the door and the window. The hours dragged by slow, every sound outside sounding sharper, louder. When daylight finally came, I walked out again to check. The footprints were there, fresh ones this time, circling the cabin twice. Whoever it was had been walking around again, close enough to touch the walls. I was done. I packed my things, loaded the truck, and decided to leave that morning. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The truck was dead. I popped the hood, checked the battery, and noticed the cables had been cut clean through. That's when I realized this wasn't some lost hiker or hunter. Whoever had been out there wanted me stuck. I grabbed my rifle and started walking, Rex trotting beside me. The nearest main road was 3 miles out, maybe a little more. I kept checking behind me every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following. The woods were quiet, too quiet for that time of morning. No birds, no rustling, just the sound of my boots and Rex's paws crunching the dirt. About halfway through, Rex stopped suddenly and started barking toward the trees behind us. I turned around fast, aiming the rifle. I didn't see anyone, but then I heard it, branches snapping, the sound of quick footsteps retreating deeper into the woods. I didn't chase, just started walking faster, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We reached the dirt road after what felt like forever. I walked until I found a signal on my phone, then called the sheriff's department. A deputy met me about an hour later, drove me back up there to check things out. When we arrived, the footprints were still fresh, leading into the woods and fading out halfway down the slope. The cabin door had been left wide open, and inside, a few of my things had been moved around. Not stolen, just touched, like whoever had been there wanted to make a point. They never found who did it. The sheriff said it might have been someone camping out illegally, or maybe a drifter passing through. But I knew it wasn't random. Whoever it was had been watching me, waiting, and they wanted me to know it. I never went back after that. I sold the land a year later. The cabin still stands, as far as I know, probably buried deeper in the trees now. Sometimes, when I take Rex for walks in the woods near my new place, he still gets tense when he hears a branch crack behind us. I do too, because no matter how long it's been, I can still remember those quiet nights, the footsteps circling the cabin, and the feeling that someone was standing just outside the dark, watching, waiting. It was late September of 2014 when I decided to spend a few days alone at an old hunting cabin near Miller Creek, a small stream that ran through the backwoods of northern Wisconsin. I was 34 then, and I had been feeling burnt out from work, from people, from the noise of city life. I just wanted quiet. No phones, no traffic, no one asking for anything. The cabin belonged to a family friend named Jim who used to hunt there years ago, but he had moved away and told me I could use it anytime. I packed light, just the basics. Some canned food, a small gas stove, a sleeping bag, flashlight, a couple of knives, and my old .22 rifle that I used for small game. I brought my dog, Cooper, a 4-year-old lab mix who didn't like being left behind. The drive took about 6 hours from my place in Milwaukee. By the time I got off the main highway, the light was already getting low. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, narrow, with overgrown grass brushing the sides of the truck. The woods were dense, the kind that block out most of the daylight even before the sun starts to go down. The cabin sat maybe a quarter mile off the road, near the edge of the creek. It was small, made of weathered pine boards, with a tin roof that looked like it had seen decades of rain and snow. The porch was crooked, one corner sinking slightly into the soft ground. The door stuck a little, but it opened after a few hard pushes. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old smoke. There was a small table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the wall. The fireplace was full of old ashes, and a stack of firewood sat by the door. I set up quickly, got the fire going, unpacked my things, and fed Cooper. The air outside was cold and still. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no music. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional splash from the creek. That first night was uneventful, except for the wind. Around midnight, it picked up hard, rattling the tin roof and making the trees creak. The sound of branches scraping against the siding woke me a few times. Cooper kept lifting his head, ears perked, but he didn't growl, so I figured it was just the weather. The next morning, I went out to look around. The forest floor was wet with dew, and mist hung low near the creek. I noticed fresh deer tracks along the bank, and some smaller prints too, maybe raccoon or fox. I walked a bit upstream and found the old trail Jim had mentioned, the one hunters used years ago. It was barely visible now, mostly overgrown. That afternoon, I chopped some more firewood and set up a small fishing line in the creek. I was planning to stay 3 nights, maybe 4, depending on how I felt. It was peaceful. For a while, I forgot about everything else. But on the second night, things started to feel different. It began with Cooper. He kept pacing near the window as the sun went down. His fur stood up slightly, and he sniffed the air like he caught a strange scent. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe a raccoon or deer wandering close. But later, when I went outside to get more wood, I felt it too. That feeling like someone's nearby, watching. The woods were darker than usual, and the air had gone dead still. Even the creek sounded quieter, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I brought the wood in, latched the door, and tried to ignore the feeling. I told myself it was just nerves. But around midnight, Cooper started growling low, deep in his throat. He was staring at the window that faced the trees. I couldn't see anything out there, just blackness between the trunks. Still, the hair on the back of my neck went up. I grabbed the flashlight and the rifle and went outside. The air was freezing. The beam from the flashlight cut through the mist, showing only small bits of the yard at a time. I scanned around the woodpile, the trees, the edge of the creek. Nothing moved, but the feeling didn't go away. I heard a faint crack, like a stick breaking somewhere deeper in the woods. It was far, but not far enough. I stayed out there for maybe 5 minutes, then went back inside and locked the door. Cooper wouldn't settle down for a long time, pacing and whining softly until he finally lay down near the door. By morning, I tried to convince myself it had been an animal, maybe a bear or coyote. The cabin was isolated. Things like that were normal out here. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Later that day, I found something that bothered me more. About 20 yards from the cabin, near the creek, I noticed footprints, human ones. They weren't mine. I wear size 10 boots, and these were larger, maybe 11 or 12. They weren't fresh, but they were clear enough to see the tread marks. Whoever made them had been walking along the edge of the creek toward the cabin. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared near the trail. It could have been some hiker or hunter passing through weeks ago, but I hadn't seen any tire marks or signs of recent activity on the access road. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside again. This time, it was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. The boards on the porch creaked once, and Cooper went wild, barking and throwing himself at the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, gripping the rifle, waiting for the next sound. The footsteps stopped after a while. I didn't hear anything else. I sat there for hours, too afraid to move. When morning finally came, I went outside and saw more prints. Clear ones this time, right by the porch steps. They led around to the side of the cabin and then back into the woods. I couldn't tell if it was the same person as before, but it looked like one pair of boots. That was enough for me. I decided to leave that day. I packed everything up fast and loaded the truck. But as I started it, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There were muddy handprints on the back of the truck bed, smeared across the tailgate. Someone had touched it recently. The road out felt longer than it had coming in. Every bend, every shadow between the trees made me tense up. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone behind me, but I didn't. When I got back home, I told Jim about it. He said he wasn't surprised. That years ago, Some drifters used to camp out near Miller Creek, sometimes squatting in empty hunting shacks. A few of them were caught breaking into cabins for food or tools. He thought maybe one of them had come back, living off the land again. I thought about that for weeks after. The footprints, the sounds, the handprints on the truck. Someone had been close enough to touch my things, close enough to stand on that porch in the dark while I sat just feet away on the other side of the wall. I haven't gone back since. Jim sold the land a few years later, and I heard the new owners tore down the old cabin. Sometimes I still think about it. That night when Cooper growled and I stared into the black woods, flashlight trembling in my hand. I'll never know who was out there or what they wanted. But the part that sticks with me most is how quiet it was that night. No wind, no frogs, no crickets. Just that silence, deep and heavy, and the sound of something human moving where no one should have been. It had been almost 4 years since my divorce from Mark, but every time I drove near the northern edge of Pine Hollow, I still felt that same heaviness in my chest. That was where our cabin sat, or his cabin now, I should say. It was a quiet, isolated place surrounded by thick woods and a dirt road that always turned muddy when it rained. We used to spend weekends there, fixing the roof, cutting firewood, cooking simple meals, and pretending we were happy. The last time I had been up that way was late October of 2019, when I'd come to grab my things before signing the final papers. It was strange how time made places look smaller, less alive. But even now, in 2024, I couldn't shake the habit of slowing down whenever I passed that turnoff road, just to see what had become of it. That evening, I had been driving back from visiting my sister in Birchfield, taking the long route through the back roads because I hated the highway traffic. It was getting dark early, that dull, gray kind of light before the sun disappears behind the trees. I hadn't planned to pass the cabin. It just happened. One wrong turn at an unmarked fork, and there it was, the small wooden sign that said, Pine Hollow Trail. I told myself I'd just drive past it, just look once and keep going. The dirt road was still the same, narrow, lined with overgrown bushes and tire grooves hardened by the sun. The air smelled like wet leaves and smoke from someone's distant chimney. I rolled down the window a bit, letting the cool air come in, and when I reached the bend where the cabin came into view, my stomach tightened. The place looked worse than I remembered. The roof was half collapsed on the left side, and the porch had started to rot away. The door was still the same faded green that I had painted one summer. The windows were covered with plywood now, and the yard was swallowed up by weeds and ferns. The chimney was leaning slightly, like it could fall at any moment. But what really caught my eye was a faint glow coming from inside. Not bright, just a soft, warm flicker, like from a lantern or candle. For a few seconds, I thought I was imagining it. Mark had moved away years ago, last I heard somewhere near the coast. The cabin shouldn't have had any power left, and nobody in their right mind would stay there. Still, I stopped the car. It was one of those moments where logic should have made me drive off, but curiosity dug its claws in. I turned off the engine and sat there for a bit, listening. The forest was quiet except for the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. Somewhere far back, a branch cracked. I tried to tell myself it was an animal. Then I saw movement inside, just a shadow crossing past that faint orange light. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Maybe some hunter or squatter using the cabin for shelter. I knew I should leave, but part of me wanted to see who it was. Maybe to see if anything was left of the life I used to have there. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, with that sharp, damp smell that comes before rain. My boots sank slightly into the soft dirt as I walked toward the cabin. Every step sounded too loud. When I got close to the porch, I noticed footprints in the mud. Not old ones either. They were fresh, big ones like a man's work boots. They led right up to the front door. The handle on the door was rusted, and one of the hinges was hanging loose, but it was shut. I tried to peek through a crack in the plywood covering one of the windows, but it was too dark to see anything. Only that faint light glowing from deeper inside. I walked around to the side where the porch steps had half collapsed. The side window had no boards, just a torn curtain. I looked in through the gap. The inside was a mess. The old couch overturned, the table missing, pieces of wood scattered across the floor. I could see the old brick fireplace, and near it, something small was burning. A candle sitting on top of a metal tin. Next to it were several empty beer bottles, a backpack, and a pile of clothes that didn't look familiar. That's when I saw it, my old photo frame still on the shelf. The one of me and Mark on the porch. It was turned face down, but I recognized the edge of it, that same dent on the corner from when it fell once. The sight of that photo hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't know why, but seeing it there made me feel sick, like something wasn't right. Then, from deeper in the cabin, I heard a noise. Not loud, just a creak of wood, slow and heavy, like someone stepping on old floorboards. I froze. The flashlight in my hand felt heavier. My throat went dry. Whoever was in there knew I was outside now. I took a step back, heart pounding, then another. My car was only about 30 yards away, but the road looked much longer than that. I turned and started walking fast, not running, just moving quickly enough to not draw attention. Halfway back, I heard it, the door creaking open behind me. I didn't look. I just kept walking faster, my boots scraping the dirt, my breathing getting louder. Then I heard the sound of feet stepping onto the porch, slow and steady. By the time I reached my car, I could feel my hands shaking. I unlocked it quietly, slid inside, and started the engine. My headlights lit up the road ahead, and for a brief second, they also lit the cabin. The front door was open now, swinging slightly in the wind, and standing just inside was a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a dark jacket. I couldn't see the face, just the outline. Whoever it was stood perfectly still, watching the car. I hit the gas. The tires spun for a moment on the soft dirt before gripping, and I drove off fast, not stopping until I reached the paved main road again. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to. I drove the next hour in silence, headlights cutting through the trees, hands still trembling on the wheel. My chest ached, not from fear anymore, but from something deeper. That cabin had always been a place tied to the worst parts of me. The arguments, the long silences, the loneliness. But tonight it felt different. Not haunted, not supernatural, just human. Someone was living there. Someone who had taken over the shell of what used to be my life. A few days later, I called the local sheriff's office anonymously, told them someone might be staying in an abandoned cabin up near Pine Hollow. They said they'd send a deputy to check it out. I didn't leave my name. A week later, I drove by again, just to see from a distance. The cabin looked even worse now. The door was gone, the candlelight gone too. A piece of yellow tape was hanging on one side of the porch. Police tape, torn and half buried in the mud. I parked far down the road and just sat there, staring. It hit me that I didn't need to know what they found. Whoever had been there, maybe a drifter, maybe Mark himself, maybe just someone lost, it didn't matter. That place was finished. The next time I drove by that road, months later, the cabin was gone. Burned down, someone told me later, after a storm hit that area. Only the stone fireplace was left standing. And for the first time in years, when I passed that spot, I didn't feel that pull anymore. No more curiosity, no more fear, just quiet, like the past had finally been buried under those ashes, right where it belonged. It was the autumn of 1998 when I decided to build a small cabin out in the woods near a place called Blackridge Hollow, a quiet stretch of land a few miles outside of Salem, Oregon. I was 28 back then, working as a carpenter's assistant in town, barely making enough to cover rent. I wanted a place that was mine, something away from the noise, the people, the constant motion. I found a cheap plot of land through an older man who owned acres of unused forest. It was rough land, full of wet soil, thorny bushes, and heavy pine trees, but I didn't care. I wanted isolation more than comfort. The cabin wasn't meant to be fancy, just a single-room structure with a small porch and a tin roof. I brought old wood planks from my job site, nails, a hammer, a few tools, and an old oil lantern. Took me 3 weeks to get the frame standing. I worked in the evenings after my shifts, sometimes through the night. The smell of damp earth and pine sap clung to me every day. I would cut wood till my hands blistered and the sound of the hammer echoed through the forest. By the time I finished the cabin, the weather had started to shift. The skies stayed gray most days, and by October, rain became a constant part of the day. It wasn't the light kind of rain that fades in an hour. It was steady, thick, and cold, hitting the tin roof like gravel. The first few nights, I stayed in the cabin with only my lantern for light, cooking canned food on a small gas stove. The roof leaked a bit near the back corner, but I didn't mind it. I just placed a bucket under the drip and let it fill slowly through the night. It was peaceful at first. I would sit on the porch after dark and listen to the rain. The forest made strange sounds, creaking branches, the distant bark of a fox, or the movement of something large brushing through wet grass. The kind of noises that don't mean much in daylight, but at night, they crawl under your skin. One evening in late October, a storm rolled in. It started before sunset and didn't let up for hours. The rain was so heavy it blurred the line between sky and trees. The wind had that low, constant hum, and every so often, I could hear something heavy fall somewhere deeper in the forest, probably a branch or maybe a tree. I had been working that day to finish a small wood shed behind the cabin, but the storm forced me to stop. My clothes were soaked through, and my boots squished with every step. When night came, I lit the lantern and sat near the small window. The glass fogged from the inside. I had a small fire going in the corner stove, but it barely warmed the room. The rain hitting the metal roof sounded almost too loud. After a while, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just rain hitting the roof. I heard what sounded like dull thumps, irregular, like something striking the outer wall every few minutes. I thought maybe it was branches being thrown by the wind, but the hits didn't sound like wood. They sounded heavier, closer. I got up and checked the door. The latch was secure. My dog, Rusty, a mixed shepherd I'd had for years, was lying near the stove, ears perked, staring at the door. He didn't bark, but he was alert, his eyes following every noise. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks. I went back to my chair, wiped condensation from the window, and looked out. All I could see was blackness, the lantern's glow only reaching a few feet into the rain. The forest was invisible behind the sheets of water. I sat back down, trying to ignore it, but the hits on the wall came again, two this time closer together. Rusty stood up and let out a low growl. That sound made me uneasy. He was a quiet dog, never growled at anything unless there was reason. I stood, grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed, and opened the door just a crack. The cold rain blew in immediately, soaking the floor. I shone the light outside but saw nothing. Just rain, mud, and the outline of trees bending in the wind. The sound had stopped. I closed the door and dropped the latch again. Rusty had moved closer to me, his body tense. I decided to keep the lantern burning through the night. The noise didn't come back for a while, but the storm stayed relentless. Around midnight, as I started to doze in the chair, I heard something scraping along the side of the cabin, slow, dragging, like metal against wood. It circled partway around the cabin and then stopped. I sat completely still. My hand was sweating around the flashlight. Rusty started pacing near the door, whining quietly. I waited for a long time before I dared to look again. When I finally opened the window shutter slightly, the beam from the lantern flickered on something out near the shed. Something pale that moved slightly, maybe just a reflection off wet bark. Couldn't tell. The rain distorted everything. I barely slept that night. I kept the lantern burning and sat listening until the sound of the storm began to fade in the early morning. When the rain finally stopped, I went outside. Everything was soaked, the ground soft enough that my boots sank into it. I walked around the cabin, and that's when I noticed them, footprints. Not boots, not paws. Bare human footprints, deep in the mud near the back wall, leading toward the shed. The prints were large, spaced wide apart, like someone heavy had walked through during the night. They were fresh, edges still sharp, not washed out by the rain. I followed them to the shed, heart pounding. The door to the shed was half open. Inside, some of my tools were scattered, and a few planks I had stacked were moved around. Nothing was stolen, but someone had definitely been there. I spent the morning cleaning up and checking around for any signs of more damage. I didn't find much, but those footprints bothered me all day. I couldn't stop thinking about someone walking barefoot through the woods in the middle of a storm. By afternoon, the sky darkened again, and I decided to pack some of my things just in case. I didn't plan on leaving, but I wanted to be ready. That night, the rain came back, lighter this time but steady. I kept the lantern close and didn't sleep. Around midnight again, I heard it. The same scraping sound, but this time softer, slower, like whoever it was knew I was listening. I didn't move. I just sat there, eyes on the window, hand on the flashlight. The sound circled halfway around the cabin and then faded into the rain. The next morning, I went outside again. The footprints were there again, this time closer to the door. Whoever it was had come right up to the steps and turned back toward the woods. I followed the trail as far as I could, maybe 100 feet, until it disappeared into the underbrush. I decided that was it. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed my tools, grabbed Rusty, and drove out before the next storm rolled in. I came back a week later with a friend from town to check on the place. When we got there, the door was open, even though I had locked it. The shed was empty. Every tool, every plank, every nail gone. There was no sign of who took them. No vehicle tracks, no boot marks, just the same bare footprints in the dried mud, leading away from the cabin into the trees. I didn't rebuild it after that. I sold the land a year later. Sometimes, when it rains hard and the wind starts to hum like it did that night, I still think about that cabin and how someone was out there, in the middle of nowhere, walking barefoot through the storm. I never found out who it was or why they were there, but I learned something important. Silence in the woods isn't peace. Sometimes it's just someone waiting for you to stop listening. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to stay at my uncle's old farm in northern Kansas. I was 26 back then, between jobs, low on cash, and looking for a quiet place to clear my head. The farm had been left untouched for years after my uncle passed away, but my father still owned it. He told me it would be a good idea to check on the property, maybe clean it up a bit, see if it could be rented out. I didn't mind. I liked the idea of a few weeks of silence, away from people. The drive out there took me almost 6 hours from Wichita. The further I went, the emptier the roads got. The fields stretched forever, golden wheat swaying under a pale blue sky. When I finally turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the property, I could see the old windmill first, its blades broken and hanging crooked. Then the farmhouse appeared, 2 stories, white paint long gone gray, roof half sagged. Behind it sat a small cabin my uncle had built years earlier. He used to stay there when he was working late or during harvest season. That cabin was where I planned to sleep. The air smelled dry and faintly sweet, like cut hay mixed with dust. I parked my truck near the barn and walked around. The place felt frozen in time. Rusted tools were scattered in the dirt, and the barn doors creaked whenever the wind picked up. Inside the farmhouse, everything was still. Plates stacked on the kitchen table, a torn curtain swaying gently in the broken window. Mice had made nests in the corners, and a layer of fine dust covered everything. I didn't want to stay inside there. The smaller cabin behind the barn felt safer somehow. It had one room, a narrow bed, a wood stove, and a table pushed against the wall. There was no electricity, just a kerosene lamp and some old candles. The window looked out toward the open fields, and when the wind blew, the tall grass rippled like waves. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but after a long drive, I didn't mind the stillness. That first night passed without anything strange. I lit a small fire in the stove, made some canned soup, and read a few pages from a book before falling asleep. The air was warm, and the smell of the fields drifted in through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped. It was peaceful in a lonely sort of way. By the third night, I started to notice small things. The barn door, which I swore I'd latched, would be open in the morning. A few tools I'd left on the workbench were moved or gone. I figured it might have been raccoons or stray dogs, but then I noticed footprints near the barn. Boot prints larger than mine, fresh in the dirt after a light rain. I walked the perimeter of the property that morning. The fence line stretched for acres, but part of it near the creek had fallen down. I thought maybe someone was using the land to cross through, maybe hunters or drifters. I patched the fence as best as I could, nailed a few boards back into place, and didn't think much more about it. Still, something about the tracks bothered me. They weren't random. They went straight to the barn, then to the cabin, then back toward the woods. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind rattled the cabin walls, and every small sound seemed louder than it should have been. Around midnight, I heard a faint scraping noise outside, like metal dragging against wood. I froze and listened. It stopped after a few seconds. When I checked the next morning, I found new marks on the side of the cabin. Deep, narrow grooves like something sharp had been scraped along the boards. I told myself it must have been an animal clawing around for food, but the lines were too straight, too even. I started keeping my hunting rifle close, just in case. By the fifth day, the air had changed. The weather turned humid, heavy, and the sky stayed overcast. The fields, which once looked calm, now felt endless and watchful. I tried to focus on work, cleaning the barn, clearing weeds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Once, while fixing a broken gate, I looked up and thought I saw movement near the far tree line. Just a shadow, but tall, human-shaped. I stared for a long time, but nothing moved again. That evening, I ate early and decided to stay inside after dark. The sun set fast, leaving everything in deep gray. I lit the lamp and sat by the window. For hours, there was nothing but the soft hiss of wind through the grass. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps outside. Not animal sounds, real footsteps, heavy ones, circling the cabin. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the rifle, waiting. The steps stopped right outside the door. Then I heard the faint click of the latch trying to lift. It didn't open, but whoever it was tried again. Then silence. I stayed awake till morning, staring at the door, the lamp still burning. When dawn came, I stepped outside carefully. There were boot prints in the mud again, circling the cabin. But this time I could see where they came from. They led from the tree line, through the tall grass, straight to my door. And then they went back, but not all of them. Half of them stopped near the window, and I could see smudges on the glass, as if someone had pressed their hands there, peering inside. I packed my things that morning. I didn't care about finishing the cleanup anymore. But when I went to start my truck, it didn't turn over. The battery was dead. I checked under the hood, and that's when I saw the battery cables had been cut clean through. Someone had done it deliberately. I didn't even think. I grabbed my backpack, rifle, and started walking toward the main road, which was about 4 miles away. It was the longest walk of my life. The sun was hot, and the fields buzzed with insects, but I kept hearing faint noises behind me. Soft crunches in the dirt, like someone following just far enough back to stay out of sight. Every time I turned, there was nothing there, just the wind and the grass shifting. I didn't stop until I reached the asphalt road. A passing farmer finally picked me up and dropped me off at a gas station in town. From there, I called my father and told him everything that happened. 2 days later, the sheriff went out to the property. They found the cut battery cables and the footprints, but nothing else. No one living nearby had seen anything. The sheriff said it might have been some drifter hiding out in the woods. Said maybe I scared him off when I stayed up that night. A few weeks later, I went back with my father to tow the truck home. The fields were quiet again, and the cabin looked the same, but something in the air still felt wrong. When I walked inside the cabin to grab the few things I'd left behind, I noticed something carved into the wooden table, something that hadn't been there before. It was a single line, deep and uneven, cut into the surface with a knife. I watched you sleep. That was the last time I ever went back to that farm. My father sold it the next year, and the new owners tore down the cabin completely. But sometimes when I drive past long stretches of wheat fields, I still think about those nights. The open fields, the sound of boots in the dirt, the feeling that someone was standing just outside the door waiting. And I always wonder how long they had been there before I finally noticed. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I was 29 at the time, and I had been working long weeks in construction with barely any rest. My mind felt like it was breaking apart from noise, people, and constant pressure. A friend from work told me about an old hunting cabin his uncle owned, far out in the woods near Flathead National Forest. He said it hadn't been used much in the last few years, but it was still standing. I thought it sounded perfect, quiet, isolated, cheap. I just wanted to be alone for a while, breathe real air, and forget the city for a bit. The drive took most of the day. The farther north I went, the thinner the traffic became, and by the time I turned off the paved road onto a narrow dirt path, I hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly an hour. The forest was heavy around me, thick pine trees rising so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground. The road twisted and climbed slowly until the trees opened up a little, revealing a valley below. There, hidden between the tall grass and trees, sat the cabin. It wasn't big, just a single story with a small porch and a slanted tin roof. The wood was darkened from age and weather, and the windows were dusty but intact. The place looked tired but solid. The air smelled of pine sap and cold dirt. I remember shutting off the truck engine and hearing nothing but the ticking of the cooling metal and distant wind moving through the trees. Inside, the cabin was simple. One small bedroom with a creaky bed frame, a main room with an old table, 2 wooden chairs, and a cast iron stove in the corner. The air was dry and had that faint smell of mice and old wood. I spent the first few hours cleaning dust off everything, sweeping the floor, airing out the place. There was a small storage shed behind the cabin that held some firewood, rusted tools, and an old axe that looked like it had been there for years. By the time the sun started to drop behind the trees, I had a small fire going inside the stove. The light flickered over the walls, and I sat at the table eating canned soup straight from the pot. Outside, the forest had gone completely still. I remember thinking how strange it was that even the birds had gone silent. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt too deep, too empty. When it got dark, I stepped out onto the porch with my flashlight. The beam cut through the trees, but the light only reached so far before it was swallowed by the black. The cold air made my breath look like smoke. Somewhere far off, I heard a single snapping sound, maybe a branch breaking. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer, and went back inside. But something about that sound stayed in my head. It didn't feel random. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cabin walls were thin, and every small noise carried through the wood. I could hear the faint creaking of the roof as the temperature dropped. At one point, I woke up to what sounded like light footsteps outside, slow, steady, circling the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I lay there for at least 10 minutes, heart pounding, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. Eventually, I told myself it must have been the wind or a raccoon and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, the air was colder. I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and I noticed prints in the dirt behind the shed. They weren't animal prints. They were boot marks, deep, clear, and fresh. Someone had been walking back there recently. The direction of the prints led toward the trees, disappearing into the forest. I stood there for a long minute, staring into the woods. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The nearest town was almost an hour away. My stomach tightened as I realized that whoever it was had probably been near the cabin while I was sleeping. I decided to stay busy. I gathered more wood, chopped a bit with the axe, and tried not to think about it. I kept the rifle that was left inside by the stove close, just in case. I told myself it was probably a hunter or some hiker who got lost. That afternoon, I hiked a little up the hill behind the cabin to see the view. From there, I could see the narrow dirt road I came from, stretching off between the trees. There was no one in sight.
No vehicles, no smoke.
Just miles of forest in every direction. When I got back, I noticed something strange. The door to the shed, which I was sure I'd closed, was wide open. I stood there staring at it. The wind was calm, and the door had a heavy latch that wouldn't swing open on its own. Inside, nothing looked stolen, but one of the firewood stacks had been moved. Not much, just enough to look disturbed. I didn't like that. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. I kept the rifle next to me and the lantern lit low. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Not close this time, but steady, moving along the tree line. It went on for minutes, fading and returning. I sat up in bed, holding the rifle, barely breathing. The sound eventually stopped again, but I didn't close my eyes after that. When morning came, I made up my mind to leave. It didn't feel right there anymore. Something was off. Not supernatural, not a ghost story, just wrong in a human way. I packed my bag and loaded it in the truck. But before I left, I walked around once more to check everything. That's when I found something that made my skin crawl. Behind the cabin, near the back wall, there was a pile of ashes. Not from my fire, but from something burned outside. Mixed in the gray ash were bits of melted plastic and what looked like small pieces of clothing. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't old. It looked recent. The ground underneath was still a little warm. I didn't wait to find out more. I got in the truck, started the engine, and drove down that dirt road without looking back. I didn't even stop in town. I just kept driving until I reached the highway. Later, when I called my coworker to tell him about it, he said his uncle had stopped going to that cabin years ago because of weird stuff. People squatting out there, signs of someone living in the woods. He said there'd been reports of tents and makeshift camps found in the area, all abandoned in strange condition. For weeks after I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me up there. Not a ghost, not anything unreal, just another person. Someone who didn't want to be found. I kept replaying the nights in my head. The footsteps, the prints, the shed door. I never went back to Montana after that. A year later, I came across a short article online. It said that a hiker had gone missing somewhere near Flathead, close to where that cabin stood. Search teams found a small camp in the woods, burnt clothes, canned food, and what looked like signs of someone living out there for months. They never found the person. The article didn't say much else, but that was enough. When I think about that weekend now, what scares me most isn't the noises or the prints. It's that whoever was out there wasn't afraid of me. They walked close enough to leave tracks, close enough to circle the cabin in the dark, and they never tried to hide the signs. They wanted me to know, and that thought, even after all these years, still keeps me awake some nights. It was October of 1998 when I decided to spend a weekend alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Maine. He hadn't used the place in years. The roof leaked, the porch leaned to one side, and the woods had almost swallowed it whole. I had been working construction in Bangor, and after a rough couple of weeks, I needed a break. Somewhere quiet, away from everything. The plan was simple: hunt, drink a few beers, and clear my head. I left my truck parked off a dirt road that cut through miles of pine. The walk to the cabin took about 15 minutes, long enough to remind me how deep in the woods I was. It was that kind of silence where you could hear your own heartbeat. The cabin sat by a small slope near a dry creek bed, one of those hand-built wooden ones from the 60s. It still had my uncle's old red canoe leaned against the side, full of leaves and rainwater. The steps creaked under my boots when I went up, and the air inside smelled like damp wood and old smoke. The first thing I did was get a fire going in the rusted iron stove. The wood was soft and a little moldy, but it caught after a few tries. Once I got the place warm, I unpacked my things: my .308 rifle, a cooler, a lantern, a sleeping bag, and a few cans of food. The only light came from the fire and a small window covered in dust. The floorboards had warped from years of moisture, and the wallpaper was peeling off in long strips. I liked that kind of silence, though. Felt honest. I spent most of the afternoon walking the woods, checking for deer tracks. There were plenty, fresh ones too, so I marked a few spots with strips of orange cloth. The ground was soft, and there was that smell of pine needles and mud after rain. Around 5, I headed back toward the cabin as the light started to fade. That stretch of forest turned darker faster than anywhere I'd been before. You could watch the sunlight disappear like someone was slowly dimming it. By the time I got back, it was cold enough that my breath came out white. I fixed a small meal, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch steps while the fire inside burned low. The woods were still, completely still, not a single sound. No wind through the trees, no frogs, no owls, just quiet. It felt strange because earlier there had been plenty of noise. I tried to ignore it, but after a while, I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling, like something nearby was also being quiet, listening. When I finally went inside, I latched the door and added another log to the stove. The flames flickered against the walls, throwing long shadows. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the old cot and lay there for a while, just staring at the ceiling. The boards creaked every now and then, like they were settling under weight. I told myself it was the wood expanding from the heat, but the sound came again, heavier this time, like a slow step. The sound stopped when I sat up. I listened hard, but the fire hissed and cracked too loudly to hear much. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon on the porch or a branch falling off a tree. Still, my stomach felt tight, and every muscle in my shoulders was tense. After a while, the sound didn't come back, and I drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up sweating. The fire had burned low to embers, and the air felt cold again. What woke me wasn't noise, it was the light. The glow from the stove flickered, and every few seconds it would dim as if something was moving between it and me. I thought maybe smoke was shifting around, but when I sat up, the stove door was closed tight. The room was so dim I could barely see past the foot of the bed. Then I caught a faint sound outside, slow crunching on the dead leaves. One step, then another. It moved along the side of the cabin, toward the porch. My heart was pounding. I reached for my rifle by the cot and held it tight, waiting. The steps stopped right outside the window. The glass was so fogged I couldn't see anything clearly, just a faint blur. Then I noticed it, a shadow crossing in front of the window, tall, wide-shouldered. It didn't move like an animal. It stood there for a few seconds, then crouched low, blocking more of the light. I froze. Every second felt like a full minute. Then, quietly, the sound of the porch boards creaked again, moving toward the door. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, gripping the rifle, the hammer half-cocked. The doorknob rattled once, slow, like someone testing it. Then again, harder. The old metal latch shook but held. I don't think I even breathed. After a moment, it stopped. I waited what must have been 15 minutes before I moved again. The fire was nearly out, and the shadows had gone long and dark. I didn't dare go outside. I sat there until daylight, rifle across my knees, staring at that door. When the sun finally came through the window, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The ground outside was damp from morning dew. I scanned the area, that's when I saw them. Footprints. Clear, heavy boot prints. Not mine. They came from the woods, circled the cabin twice, then stopped right at the front steps. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. The dirt was pressed deep, and one of the boards on the railing had a fresh mark, like something metal scraped against it. I followed the tracks for a few yards into the woods until they disappeared into the thicker brush. The path they took wasn't random either. They came from the direction of the dirt road where I'd parked my truck. I felt a knot tighten in my gut. Whoever that was had probably seen me drive in, waited until dark, and then came up here. The thought of that made my skin crawl. I packed my things fast. I didn't even finish my breakfast. I just threw everything into my bag and took down the fire. Before leaving, I looked around one last time. There was something else. About 20 feet from the cabin, under a pine tree, I saw a small pile of cigarette butts. They weren't old either, still dry, like they'd been left last night. I don't smoke. My uncle didn't either. Someone had been out there for a while, watching. I hiked back to my truck fast, every sound making me jump. When I got to the road, I saw another set of prints near the mud by the passenger side door. The door handle had fresh scratches on it, too, like someone had tried to open it with something. I started the engine and drove until I hit the highway, not looking back once. When I got home, I told my uncle about it. He wasn't surprised. He said a few cabins in that area had been broken into over the years, usually by squatters or people living off the grid. Some just watched places for weeks, waiting to see if someone left food or gear behind. I couldn't stop thinking about that maybe the person who circled my cabin wasn't just curious, but waiting for me to fall asleep. I never went back after that. My uncle offered to sell the cabin a few years later, but I told him to leave it. I still remember the way those footsteps sounded on the porch, slow and heavy, pausing just long enough to listen. Every time I think about it, I realize how close I probably came to never waking up. Now, whenever I camp or hunt, I keep my truck nearby, keys in my pocket, and I never, ever spend a night in a place I can't leave in 10 seconds. Because that night taught me something simple. You don't need ghosts or monsters to be afraid of the dark. Sometimes the scariest thing out there is just another person, waiting, It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a few days off from work and drive north into the countryside of England. I lived in Birmingham at the time, and I'd been feeling trapped. City noise, traffic, and the constant rush of people had worn me down. I wanted silence. I found a small rental cabin listed online, located somewhere near the edge of Northumberland National Park. The photos showed it surrounded by trees, a small gravel path leading to it, and a quiet stream running behind it. It looked old, but I didn't mind that. I just wanted space and peace for a few days. The drive took almost 6 hours. I remember the last stretch of road being narrow and lined with thick hedges. The GPS lost signal about 20 minutes before I arrived, so I followed printed directions the owner had emailed me. When I finally reached the cabin, the air outside was cool and damp, and the sky looked like it might rain. The place stood alone, surrounded by tall oaks and pines, with no other houses visible in any direction. There was a stone path leading to the porch and a small wooden shed to the side. Inside, the cabin was plain, a bit dusty but livable. A single bedroom, a kitchen with an old stove, and a sitting room with a worn-out sofa and a small fireplace. There was no television, just a radio, and the weak smell of damp wood everywhere. I unpacked, made tea, and sat by the window for a while. The forest behind the cabin looked endless, with the stream barely visible between the trees. It felt isolated, in a strange but calming way. By late evening, it started raining steadily. The sound of the rain on the roof and the wind against the windows was the only noise I heard for hours. I turned off the lights early and went to bed, listening to the rain slow down. It must have been close to midnight when I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first, maybe the wind or some branch falling outside, but when I sat up, I noticed something odd. Through the small gap in the curtain, I could see movement outside near the shed. It was faint at first, just a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure, a woman. She was standing just beyond the porch light, facing the direction of the cabin. She wasn't moving, just standing there. My first thought was that maybe it was a lost hiker or someone from a nearby house, but there wasn't any other house nearby, at least none that I had seen on the drive-in. I stayed still, trying to make sense of it. After a minute or so, I got up quietly and looked out through the side window. The figure was still there. She was wearing what looked like a long, dark coat, maybe black or navy, and her hair looked tangled and long. I couldn't see her face clearly. It was too dark, and the porch light only reached halfway across the yard. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for her to move, but she didn't. She just stood there, facing toward the cabin, in the rain. I didn't go outside. I locked the door, pulled the curtains shut, and tried to tell myself she'd leave soon. Maybe she was drunk, or lost, or waiting for someone. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't relax. Every creak from the wooden walls made me jump. I sat there on the edge of the bed until I eventually dozed off again sometime after 2 a.m. When I woke up the next morning, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was coming through the window. I got up quickly and checked outside. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone. The ground near the shed was muddy, but I could see faint footprints leading away toward the trees. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into the leaves and wet ground. I tried to put it out of my mind. Maybe someone had gotten lost and wandered past. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I made breakfast, read a bit, and went for a walk later in the afternoon to calm myself down. The forest was quiet except for birds and the distant rush of water from the stream. But even there, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never quite left. That evening, around sunset, I gathered some wood and lit the fireplace. I wanted to make it feel cozy inside, like the photos had looked. I sat near the fire with my dog. I'd brought him with me for company, and read until it got dark. At some point, he lifted his head, ears up, staring toward the window. Then he let out a low growl. I froze. I turned off the lamp and went to the window slowly. I pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. She was there again, standing in almost the same spot as the night before, this time closer to the porch. Her coat was soaked again, and her hair hung straight down, dripping. I could see her more clearly now in the dim light from inside. Her face looked pale, older, maybe in her late 50s, but what struck me most was that she didn't look scared or confused. She looked calm, almost like she was waiting for something. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, staring, until I realized she had moved slightly. Just one slow step forward. That was enough for me. I backed away, locked the door, and grabbed my phone. No signal. I tried walking around the room, by the window, near the door, nothing. I even stepped onto the porch to try catching a signal. But when I did, she was gone. The yard was empty again. That night, I barely slept. Every small noise made me sit up. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like light footsteps outside the cabin, moving slowly across the porch. Then came a faint tapping. Not hard knocking, just gentle, spaced-out taps on the wooden wall near the front door. I stayed completely still, clutching my dog close, waiting for it to stop. After a few minutes, it did. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I started packing as soon as it got light out. I didn't care about the booking or refund. I just wanted to get out. When I stepped outside, the ground was covered with wet leaves. As I walked to my car, I noticed something by the shed. The same faint footprints again, this time leading all the way up to the steps of the porch. When I loaded my things into the car and turned to check the cabin one last time, I noticed something else. The back door, the one that led to the small kitchen area, was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. I was certain. I walked slowly toward it and looked inside. Nothing looked out of place, but the cold air coming through that doorway felt wrong. I closed it, locked it again, and left without looking back. The drive back felt longer. I didn't stop anywhere until I reached the main highway. I pulled into a petrol station and tried to shake off what I'd seen. I told myself I'd probably overreacted, that maybe she was some local woman wandering near the woods. Still, something about the way she just stood there, silent and still, bothered me more than I could explain. A week later, out of curiosity, I looked up the property again online. The listing was gone. I searched the area name and found an old local news article from 2009. It mentioned a woman who had gone missing from a nearby village. She'd lived alone on the edge of the forest, not far from where I had stayed. They never found her. The article said she'd been known to walk the woods at night, sometimes approaching cabins in the area, confused and disoriented. People had reported seeing her before she vanished completely. I don't know if it was her I saw. I don't know if she's still out there or if my mind just connected the story afterward to make sense of it. But I do know that I saw someone twice in that same spot in the rain watching the cabin silently. Since then, I haven't gone back to any isolated cabins. Whenever I drive through quiet wooded areas, that image comes back. The still figure in the dark, soaked in rain, facing me but never saying a word. I never found out who she was or what she wanted, but I think that's what makes it worse. It wasn't some ghost story or trick of the light. It was real. Someone was there. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to spend a few quiet days alone in an old hunting cabin my uncle used to own near the Coconino National Forest in northern Arizona. The place was miles away from the nearest town, hidden deep in the woods where cell service dropped off completely, and the road leading there was nothing more than a dirt track covered in dry pine needles and rocks that crunched beneath the tires. I wanted silence, a break from everything, just a few nights of calm, away from people and noise. I didn't plan on anything strange. I just wanted to clear my head. The cabin had been abandoned for a while. My uncle passed a few years earlier, and nobody in the family cared to go back there after that. The front porch sagged a little on one side, and the old wooden steps creaked loudly when I first set foot on them. The windows were dusty, the air smelled of stale wood, and the place was cold even though the day outside wasn't. It had one small bedroom, a short hallway that led to a kitchen, and a back door that opened into thick trees. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes you hear your own breathing. I unpacked slowly, leaving my bag near the bed and setting my flashlight, a knife, and a small camping lantern on the kitchen table. The forest outside was still and quiet. No wind, no movement, not even the usual sound of birds. That was the first thing that felt off to me. Forests aren't supposed to be completely silent, not during the day. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the change in elevation or maybe the season. Still, it stayed in the back of my mind. The first night passed quietly enough. I made myself some canned food, read a bit, and fell asleep on the old couch in the living room. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something walking outside. At first, I thought it was a deer. The sound was slow, heavy, stepping through the dry leaves and snapping small branches. It circled the cabin once, paused near the window, and then moved away into the woods. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. It went quiet again, and after a while, I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. That's when I noticed the footprints, not animal prints, but something that looked human, though wrong somehow. They were barefoot, long, with toes that seemed too spread out. The stride was uneven, as if the person had a limp or was dragging one leg. The prints led from the woods to the side of the cabin, stopped right below the window where I'd been sleeping, then turned and disappeared back into the trees. I felt uneasy but told myself it could have been a hiker, maybe someone drunk or lost. Still, it didn't sit right. The nearest trail was about 5 miles away, and anyone wandering around barefoot in that area would have torn up their feet on the rocks and pine needles. I checked the doors and windows, made sure everything was locked, and kept the lantern close by for the next night. That evening, the forest felt different again. The air was heavy, and there was a strange smell, like damp soil mixed with something metallic, faint but constant. As the sun went down, the silence grew thicker. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and dragging, moving in a circle around the cabin. I sat up, listening. The sound stopped, then started again from the opposite side, as if whatever it was knew I was following it with my ears. At one point, something brushed against the outside wall, a faint scraping sound, like fingers or claws dragging across wood. I held my flashlight tightly, the beam shaking slightly in my hand, and stared at the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like hours, everything went still. In the morning, I walked out again. The same prints were there, but this time, there were more of them, circling the cabin completely. In some places, it looked like the thing had knelt down, its hands pressed into the dirt, long, thin fingers with deep impressions where nails might have been. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I started thinking maybe it was an animal deformity or someone playing a prank. But there was no sign of tire tracks, no new footprints other than those strange ones. The third night was worse. The footsteps didn't start until around 3, but when they did, they came faster, heavier. The sound wasn't just outside now. I could hear something tapping at the walls, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the nearest window. Through the glass, I saw something, a shape tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the treeline. It looked like a man, but its proportions were wrong. The shoulders were narrow, the arms long, and it stood too still, almost like it was holding its breath. I didn't move, I just kept watching it. Then it shifted, not walking, not turning, but almost sliding sideways, smooth and quiet. stopped again, still facing the cabin. I lowered the light slowly, my hands shaking, and sat back against the wall. I stayed like that until dawn, never closing my eyes again. When daylight came, I packed my bag. I told myself I was done. I didn't care if it sounded paranoid. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my stuff into the truck, I noticed movement near the back of the cabin. A small clearing leading deeper into the woods. There, hanging from a tree branch, was something that made my stomach twist. It was a dead deer, but its legs were bent at impossible angles, and the skin on its face was missing. It wasn't eaten or torn apart by animals. It was peeled off almost carefully. The ground below it was covered in footprints, the same ones I'd seen before. That was it for me. I got into the truck and drove until I hit the paved road, barely looking in the mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached Flagstaff. I stayed in a motel that night and barely slept, still hearing those slow footsteps in my head. The next morning, I went to a small diner and sat there for a while, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I was eating, I noticed something strange. The local paper on the counter had a small section about missing hikers near the same area. 3 in the last 2 months. All vanished near the forest edge where my uncle's cabin was. No signs of struggle, no blood, just gone. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I sold the truck 2 weeks later, left the state, and never went back to that cabin again. A few months after that, I got a call from my cousin. He'd gone out there with a few friends to check the place out. He said the cabin was completely empty. No furniture, no tools, no signs anyone had been there for years. He said it looked abandoned for a decade, dust covering everything, cobwebs in the corners, like no one had set foot inside since my uncle died. I didn't know what to say to that. I'd slept there just a few months before, eaten at that same table, seen the footprints outside. But according to him, there was nothing. Not even the smell of burnt lantern oil or food cans left behind. I didn't argue. I just hung up. I don't know what I saw in those woods or what followed me those nights. I only know what I heard, what I smelled, what I saw with my own eyes. The footprints, the shape outside the window, the deer hanging from the tree. And sometimes, even now, years later, when I'm driving at night and see something standing just off the shoulder of the road, tall and still in the dark, I can't help but think back to that cabin. Because whatever that thing was, it wasn't gone. It was watching then, and maybe it still is. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a short trip out of town to clear my head. I had been working long hours at a construction company in Leeds, and I felt like I hadn't breathed fresh air in months. So, I took a few days off, packed a few things in my car, and drove north toward the rural parts of Northumberland. My plan was simple: find a quiet place near the woods, spend a few nights, hike a bit, and maybe fish in one of the nearby streams. I didn't plan to run into anything unusual. By the second day, I had already started feeling more relaxed. The air was cool and dry, the roads empty, and the landscape was full of rolling fields and patches of forest that stretched for miles. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to take a detour off the main road to explore a forest trail I saw on a small, faded sign. The road leading into the woods was barely a road anymore, just 2 muddy tracks filled with ruts, overgrown grass, and scattered branches. My car, a dented 2009 Ford Focus, wasn't built for off-road driving, but I managed to push through carefully, avoiding the deeper mud patches. After about 2 miles, I came to a clearing. That's when I noticed the cabin. It looked abandoned right away. The roof had patches of missing shingles, the walls were gray and warped from weather, and the windows were dark and cracked. There was no path leading to it anymore, just a thick carpet of fallen leaves and overgrown weeds that had swallowed what used to be a walkway. I parked a little distance away, thinking I'd just take a quick look, Something about the place drew me in, like the curiosity of finding a forgotten piece of history in the middle of nowhere. The air was still, not a single bird or bug making a sound. It felt heavy, like everything around had paused. I remember stepping closer and hearing the crunch of leaves under my boots. The smell of rot hung in the air, a mix of damp wood and something sour. The cabin had a small porch with 2 steps, both soft and spongy under my weight. The front door was slightly open, hanging crookedly from one hinge. Inside, the light barely made it through. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling every time I moved. The floor was covered in broken glass, old newspapers, and rotting furniture. There was a table near the wall with a few rusted tools scattered across it, and an old iron stove in the corner, its pipe half collapsed. Everything looked untouched for decades. I walked slowly, careful where I stepped. The air smelled of mold and old smoke. There were muddy boot prints on the floor, faint but fresh enough that they weren't covered in dust. I froze when I noticed that. The prints didn't belong to me. They were larger, and they led toward the back of the cabin. For a few seconds, I stood still, listening. Nothing, just the creaks of old wood and the faint hum of wind outside. Part of me wanted to leave right away, but curiosity pulled me forward. The back of the cabin had a narrow hallway leading to what looked like a bedroom. The door was halfway shut. When I nudged it open, it scraped against the floor with a slow, dragging sound. Inside was a small bed frame with a torn mattress, a rusted lantern on the floor, and an old wardrobe leaning sideways. The smell was stronger there, something like wet soil mixed with decay. I noticed more footprints near the bed, but they looked smeared, as if someone had been pacing or turning around. My heart started pounding, not out of panic, but out of pure unease. The logical side of my mind tried to reason it out. Maybe someone came here recently, a hunter or a vagrant. Still, the idea of not knowing who or why they were here made me feel exposed. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard something outside. Not loud, just a faint crunch of leaves. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, steady, deliberate. I held my breath and stared at the open doorway. The sound moved closer, stopped, then started again. My first thought was that someone might have seen my car and come to check. But when I peered through a crack in the wall, I couldn't see anyone. I backed away quietly and stepped into the main room again. My boots made the floor creak, and the sound outside stopped immediately. Then came another noise, this time near the porch. It was the sound of wood shifting, like someone putting weight on the step. I could feel my pulse in my throat. There was nowhere to hide except behind the old table, so I crouched there, not daring to breathe. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. Then the door moved, slowly, pushed wider by something from outside. The light shifted across the floor. I waited for a person to step in, but no one did. Just silence again. I stayed like that for maybe a minute, then slowly stood up, grabbed a piece of metal from the floor, and decided to walk out. I didn't care to find out who or what was out there. I just wanted to get back to my car. I stepped outside, looking around. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still, and the wind had picked up just slightly. Everything looked calm again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching. As I made my way back to the car, I noticed something strange about the ground near the edge of the clearing. There were tire tracks, fresh ones. My car's tracks went in one direction, but another set came from the opposite side, stopping only a few meters from where I had parked earlier. The mud was still wet where the tires had sunk in, which meant whoever it was had been there recently, maybe while I was inside the cabin. I got into my car and started the engine right away. As I turned it around, my headlights swept across the cabin one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw movement near the window, a quick shift, like someone stepping away. It was too fast to be sure. I didn't stick around to check. I drove out of there as fast as the uneven road would let me, my tires sliding and bouncing over the mud. The road back to the main highway felt twice as long. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but there was nothing. When I finally hit the paved road, I didn't stop driving until I reached a small gas station miles away. I parked there, got out, and walked straight to the restroom to wash my hands. That's when I noticed the mud on my jacket wasn't just from the ground. It had a darker stain mixed in, dried and rough against the fabric. I didn't think much about it then, but later that night, when I checked again, it looked more like old blood. I threw the jacket away the next morning and decided not to tell anyone what happened. It sounded stupid when I tried to put it into words. Some abandoned cabin in the woods, footsteps, and a few strange tracks. But deep down, I knew there had been someone there. Not a ghost, not anything supernatural. Just someone real, maybe living out there, maybe watching that cabin for anyone who wandered too close. A few weeks later, I read a short piece online about a missing man whose car had been found deep in a wooded area north of Northumberland. The photo in the article showed a place I recognized, the same clearing, the same cabin. Police had found no sign of the man, only his car parked nearby and signs of someone staying in the cabin. They mentioned personal items left behind, but no details. I didn't sleep well for days after reading that. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd stayed a little longer or gone there at night instead of during the day. That cabin wasn't haunted. It was worse, it was real. Someone had been living there, and for a moment, I had walked straight into their space without realizing it. I've never gone back. I don't even like driving near the countryside anymore. Every time I see a dirt road or a stretch of forest, I remember that cabin. The smell of rot, the fresh footprints, the quiet sound of someone moving outside while I stood alone inside. It's not ghosts that scare me anymore. It's people. The ones you don't see, the ones hiding where no one ever looks.